R. Buckminster Fuller is known around the world as architect, poet, inventor, and philosopher. Bucky Fuller.
The humane city, what it might be, is a very challenging matter. But number one, I think we have to realize, in trying to answer that properly, that human beings are probably not on our little planet just to be amused or displeased, that we probably have a very important function in the universe. And quite unique, clearly, what is unique about humans in contradistinction to any other phenomena we know is their minds. So that I would say a humane city would have to give the human beings the time and the ease with which to really use their minds and not just their muscles and wasting their time. I don't think you could possibly design a humane city if you designed it, how do you make money out of the real estate? You'd have to quite clearly try to accommodate human beings on our planet who are all becoming very rapidly world interested and world citizens, and they are going to continually deploy for various experiences around the world, and they're going to converge from time to time, converging as we are here in the city. So we do not have a city ever again where people are just designed to be put and stay throughout their whole life. All of them are going to be very transient and higher and higher frequency of transiency. In order to be able then to have really, to me, satisfactory to humans city, we'd have to solve many other problems, as for instance just the method in which human beings account their energies, account their wealth. I'm convinced that humanity is incredibly wealthy today. That is, has the know-how to take care of all humanity, the highest standard of living anybody's ever known, but is preoccupied with long, age-held misassumptions that there's nowhere nearly enough resources with which to support all of human life. It has to be you or me, with world society sorrowfully spending $200 billion each year for the last 20 years on the wastefulness of getting ready for war, just to destroy, which increases the scarcity of the effective life support. I think then, thinking about the ideal city for humans, it'd have to be then one which is going to gradually accommodate what we're here for, or else I think we are not going to stay on our planet very long anyway. That is, really accommodate the extraordinary intellectual, mental ingenuity capabilities of humans, with very little to frustrate it. Inasmuch as we are all here for problem solving with those minds, it will not eliminate problems. But the local problems of the universe are other than just how may we get on. It will get away completely from the idea of inventing jobs in order to have people have life support buying capability. We will not waste the extraordinary amounts of gasoline just getting to work and away from work. We will not waste a great deal of the great resources of Earth really for invented jobs, invented ways of getting life support distributed. So I'll simply say my statement is that the ideal city can be designed. We know how to do it technically. Whether we really realize it is no matter how rapidly humanity really gets over onto a proper accounting system of what its real wealth is and really knows its high potential of real success for all.
Congressman Udall is, among other things, which are better known, including some possible candidacies, is chairman of the Environmental Subcommittee of the House Committee on Interior and Insular Affairs. He's written a number of books, but he has a profound interest in how our cities work and how we live. Mo Udall.
Thank you, Bill Raspberry. I remember in the early days of the John Kennedy administration in 1961, all kinds of problems had arisen, the Bay of Pigs. Congress, unlike its typical demeanor, was acting up, and taxpayers were unhappy, and problems abounded. And Kennedy said one day in a staff meeting, "The chickens have come home to roost, and it appears that we might have moved into the chicken coop." And I rather think maybe that's where we are with urban problems here in the year 1975. Each of our lives have chapters that begin and end. The time you left home, closed the door on a house where you'd been reared, or left high school for the last time as a student. I think the lives of nations have chapters too. And history, looking back, I suspect, is going to say that in the early 70s we ended a chapter in our national life. It was a chapter based on a couple of things that will never come again. One was apparently cheap, abundant, unlimited supplies of oil. With those supplies of oil, we built an interstate highway system, took most of our traffic off the railroads and practically dismantled them, built rings of suburbs around our cities and made them refuges for the poorest elements in society. It was a great time when the magic word was growth, and if there were problems, more growth would solve those problems. I don't think that time will come again. I think the energy crisis that's upon all of us, the end of this era of cheap energy, cheap land, cheap resources of all kinds, is going to force us to go back and take a look at our cities and maybe, in that overworked phrase, make them livable once again. It's also clear to me that as we go into the middle 1970s, that the problems of the cities can no longer be compartmentalized. It used to be that a presidential candidate could say to the country, here in separate compartments is my defense program, here's what I propose to do in foreign affairs, here's my program for the farmers, and here's an urban program. Well, today, they're all intermixed. All of these problems are intermixed like the threads of a pretzel. What we do about oil and energy drastically affects the plight of cities like New York, and has a lot to say about the price of fertilizer for farmers, and is deeply involved in what we do in the Mideast and the possibility of an eruption there and another oil embargo, which would have drastic consequences on our society. So there isn't any place to hide anymore. And the challenge of the 70s and the 80s is to go back to our cities and find ways to make them work. And there isn't any magic solution. The Secretary of HUD here doesn't have one. I don't have one. I don't think the President has one. I don't think anyone in this room has one. But human beings have God-given intelligence, and they better try. We better try to find the threads of policy on transportation and jobs and schools and the other health and all of the rest that affect life in our cities. And we better find answers, and if the things we try don't work, we better try some other things, because this is where the action is going to be in the 70s and 80s, and we're going to have to give it our very best try.
Thank you. You don't have to be an expert on housing to be a good Secretary of Housing and Urban Development. But you do have to have some smarts. Carla Anderson Hills has smarts in spades, I'm told. She is altogether willing to be blunt and outspoken and to the point on things that she considers important. The future of our cities is of obvious importance to her. Mrs. Hills.
Thank you, Mr. Raspberry. In the last half-decade, we've been forced to the realization that we have been a wasteful people. The gas crisis taught us that we wasted energy. Our environmental friends taught us that we waste the air and the water resources upon which we depend for our very survival. And another wasting resource is our cities, which are decaying in full view of all of us. Somehow, in our years of abundance, we developed the notion that we could discard and replace our cities. And I think, as Mr. Udall has stated, the past decade saw public as well as private investment literally financing the building of ring upon ring of suburbs encircling the inner city core. As the central cities grew old and the structures within them grew worn. Those who could fled to the outer fringes, into the newly built suburbs. And this suburban sprawl has consumed literally millions upon millions of acres of open spaces and has encouraged the waste of millions of dollars of urban resources. For example, in New York City alone last year, 35,000 units of housing were abandoned. And the waste there is not in the housing alone, for an abandoned house abandons a part of all those supportive assets which give the city life: utilities, transportation, schools, hospitals, all of which take years to build. A tighter economy, scarcity of energy, and changing demographic trends mandate that we use all the ingenuity that we can summon to preserve and recycle these assets. Our studies at HUD conclude statistically that which we should have concluded intelligently years ago, that it is far less costly to recycle our cities than it is to build new suburbs. And urban redevelopment may consume 50% less land, 55% less capital, 45% less energy, and create 45% less air pollution. But apart from the costs involved, America has been undergoing considerable changes in its lifestyles. Singles, young marrieds, and elderly account for 82% of the net population increase in the years of 1970 to 1973. And there is a growing demand for low and moderate cost housing near to job opportunities, cultural amenities, and the various opportunities that our cities can afford. I think today that America is looking over the advantages of urban living that she carelessly overlooked before. And at the same time, HUD is celebrating the first birthday of the Housing and Community Development Act passed a year ago August, which seeks as one of its goals to preserve our urban communities. For the first time, the federal government is providing rental subsidies, $1.6 billion a year, to help house our lower income families in existing and substantially rehabilitated structure, giving a preference where there is an economic mix. And for the first time, our local communities direct how, when, and where federal community development funds are to be spent, and they're more than $8 billion over a 3-year period. Our first-year experience with these funds show that local communities are in fact directing 60% of their $2.6 billion this past year to rehabilitating our urban neighborhoods. So I think that we have learned that a city is people, and that a healthy city is all kinds of people in every economic strata, providing energy, creativity, ingenuity, earning power, and personal involvement. That's the mix that gives the city a healthy heartbeat, an exciting ambiance, and a responsive spirit. And that's my definition of a humane city, and it is our great urban hope. In fact, that's what HUD is all about. Thank you.
Thank you. You ought to be primed now for the most important part of our program, your part. This is what makes it a town meeting. We're ready now to take some questions. And please, no speeches. If you insist on a speech, make sure that it has a question mark at the end of it and that it's not very long. We do have just an hour. Yes.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. I'm on. My name is Carl Cohen, and I represent the National Association of Home Builders, which I guess is the progenitor of that urban sprawl which each of the speakers has mentioned here. And there has been what we could call a lot of sprawl, but I would like the members of this panel to answer two very difficult and hard questions. And these questions relate to why did we have that sprawl, and what can we do to prevent that sprawl and rejuvenate our cities with positive, actual programs? Because if you look at it in an honest, unbiased fashion, you will see that the sprawl, as it's so called, occurred because it was less expensive to build housing in the suburbs for people than it was in the cities. And until we bite that bullet of willing to pay for it and come up with the means of doing it, we're not going to be able to have the humane city. We're not going to be able to do it with small amounts of money or with programs which remain suspended for years on end. And I would like to ask each of the panelists, if they could, to address this, the exact how we're going to do it, and not the general platitudes that we so often hear. And I'm not saying that in a critical fashion of each of these speakers. But we hear a lot about how we're going to, about what we should do, but we hear very little of how we're going to do it and what it's going to cost us.
Very good. Who wants to go first on that one? The Secretary of HUD?
Mr. Cohen, it is less expensive to build in the suburbs than it is to build new structures in the suburbs in most instances than to build new structures in our cities because of land costs. And frequently there's an unavailability of land. But it is not more expensive to, when you compare rehabilitation costs in our city, recycling and use of our assets that are already in place. And we range from using existing housing for our lower income population, where the cost of subsidy is approximately half, as when we are in a tight housing market and are required to build new. So that why we had the suburb building in the first place, I think, was because we felt that there was no other way to handle housing problems. And we ignored the structures that could have been used, which were in our cities. And we literally enticed people out of the cities, leaving the cities crippled and without a tax base or an economic mix. What can we do today? I think our community development funds, with which we are providing the cities, is a healthy first step. No longer do we mandate from Washington how those funds will be spent, but it is up to the local communities, and indeed they're spending a majority of those funds to rehabilitate urban neighborhoods. Secondly, instead of counting on new structures to house our lower income population, we are also using existing and rehabilitated structures. That puts back in use assets within our cities, which are frequently nearer to employment opportunities. I think that there are a number of other programs in the federal government that assist concentrating our attentions to the problems of the cities, and I think they are beneficial.
Yes, Mr. Udall?
Let me supplement that. I agree with almost everything the Secretary said here. Why did it happen? It happened in large part because the home builders were responding to economic forces. There was a market. Housing was cheap in the suburbs. But it isn't going to happen anymore. We simply postponed the social costs. We had a tax system which, in effect, subsidized and encouraged rings of suburbs and penalized people who wanted to stay in the city and own homes there. What do we do about it? Well, we're in trouble. The home builders know it. The fact is that today, the new home builders' homes in suburbs around this country have been priced out. The new homes, the median price, is out of the range of 80% of the American people. 4 out of 5 American families, according to a recent study, can't afford to buy and to maintain and to pay for the median priced home out in the suburbs. I think one of the things that we might do would be for the friendly folks down at the National Home Builders to stop opposing sensible land use planning legislation. Which would let us have some additional suburban housing. Obviously, we're going to have it, which would let us restore and rehabilitate some of the inner older suburbs, but would also, I think, show the true costs of, as Mrs. Hills has pointed out, that the long-term costs to go back downtown and rebuild and rehabilitate our inner cities are cheaper than building another ring of suburbs with all of the costs that are there.
Mr. Fuller?
I don't want to dwell on negatives, and I feel that the answer to the question of how it happened, the urban sprawl, was there was no social organization. Though there are a great many who study planning, planners have no authority, and they find that plans for communities continually overridden by those who find ingenious ways of making money. And we've just seen orchard after orchard belonging to a farmer go out of farming because a real estate man came along so that he could make some money out of that. And he gets an option on it, and he's been had all kinds of federal help and the money with which he could manipulate, get it in his sewers and so forth, and start making a very large amount of money. It's been entirely a matter of individual ingenuity in how to make money that we've had the urban sprawl. I'd like to talk a little on the positive side here. I've been thinking about and concerned with this problem since back in the early 20s, almost fully a half century, and I've learned that in the building arts we have a very great lag in the rate of realization of inventions. In the electronics arts, there's only a 2-year lag between an invention and industrial use, a 5-year lag in aeronautics, a 10-year lag in automobile building, 15-year lag in railroading, a 25-year lag in large buildings, and a 50-year lag in the individual homes. We have World War I became a world war because it involved not just the agricultural advantages of the different countries, but suddenly realization that taking metals, for instance, tin from Malay Straits and throwing it thinly onto steel sheet, you could make tin cans which could hermetically seal food, and foods that used to rot and never reach mouths could suddenly reach people around the world. An entirely new world resource, which was the metals, came into use. And that's why it was called World War I, rather than the local farming identities of individual nations. We have then, in that World War I, enormous production was developed. And with that production came after the war, the production capability did not go away. And it was invested two main ways, in producing automobiles, which the banks did not like because they did not like that kind of mortgage. But radio went into farm machinery and selling that farm machinery to the farmers and on time. And the banks did like that because they took in not only chattel mortgage on the machinery, but on mortgages on the farms. In a bad year, 1926, the farmers could not pay their installments on the machinery, and gradually all the farms were taken in as closed mortgages. And this was the whole basis of the great 29 crash. When the United States New Deal came in and found then that the banks really did not have any money, and they had a lot of mortgages, and the United States had to we the people had to rehabilitate our economy. We then tried to first rehabilitate those mortgages. So we started, even with negative interest loans, to get people to put a new roof or to put a bathroom in the house, which they didn't have before. Anyway, to improve the value of those equities, which the government then was underwriting. And the United States undertook to back the whole building industry. Now, building industry, in contradistinction to the weaponry industry, there has to be priority and there has to be anti-priority. Priority has always been for the weaponry industry on the assumption that not enough to go around, we're coming to war. And the anti-priority has always been the home front. And in contradistinction to the kind of structures we build to go in the sky, like a Boeing 747, fantastic kind of a structure, what goes into the building of homes has been really what's been left over that is not wanted for any other kind of purpose. So the bigger and heavier and higher the walls, up to time of the Maginot Line, the more secure people felt. So this has been, I'm simply saying to you, the building industry, what's called the building industry, is a building art that is approximately 5,000 years behind the aeronautical and the base building art. If we go, you go to the island of Crete, which I've done many, many times, and you find the old Palace of Knossos, the water running in the plumbing system is exactly the same plumbing system we have today. Been no improvement in 3,400 years. No scientist has ever been engaged to look at the plumbing, to see what you do with the beautiful, valuable energy that we're letting go back to turn in what we call pollution, so forth. I find that the now that I have over 100,000 geodesic structures around the world, most of them delivered by air, I can tell you that I can give you 30 buildings for one, for given earthquake loading, fireproofing, tornado proofing, whatever it may be. I give you 30 buildings for one against the best alternate engineering strategies known for that clear spanning. So that I know that we're being very, very wasteful in our buildings, and we now know how, if we didn't have to beat the present engineering codes, but really use the aeronautical kinds of engineering, we could give you 300 buildings for one. I know that if humanity is going to stay on our planet, we are very shortly going to have to come to comprehensive disarmament. We come to disarmament, and the aeronautical and airspace technology is really released. The productivity of the aeronautical space technology is released to human problems. It became very clear, for instance, in the aircraft designing industry, dealing with the top scientists there as much as 10 years ago. We found that it would be possible to build a whole city skyscraper horizontally in an aircraft plant very rapidly under controlled conditions, not out under the rain and winds and nonsense. And then it could be delivered horizontally by air and upended. Be perfectly possible to deliver a whole city in a day. And that's what we're going to do, not repair the old nonsense.
Let's take a question from over here.
Mr. Chairman, my name is Julius Lieblein. I would like to have the views of each of the speakers on the architectural concepts of Paoli Soleri, who has proposed that an entire city be built in a single structure, even if it has to be a mile high, so as to eliminate problems of transportation and the place of living being distant from the place of work.
Well, someone described or defined mixed feelings as watching your mother-in-law drive off the cliff in your uninsured Cadillac. If I can be forgiven what's now known as sexist humor, I have mixed feelings about Soleri's work. In one sense, this is the efficient way to go. If we insist on peopling this planet with 4 billion now and 8 billion in 20 years and 16 or 20 billion in 30 years or whatever the projections show, obviously we're going to have to look to see how we preserve some kind of quality of life and some kind of human relationships with those numbers of people. And obviously these concepts do handle the most people in the most limited amount of space, and do preserve the outdoors for those who want to see it, and do keep you close to your home and your office. On the other hand, as a human being who grew up in the wilds and the beauties of northern Arizona in Grand Canyon and Painted Desert country, I frankly confess to grave misgivings about moving me into one of these things that are 2 miles high and 2 miles across and contain a million of my fellow human beings. So I have mixed feelings on this subject.
My feelings are similarly mixed. I think we are, however, going to have to look at a number of innovative ideas in the future, and some of them can be applied part-wise or be modified in some ways, and I think we'll get benefit from them. We have had instruction from a variety of demonstration projects, and this one may have aspects that can have application in the future.
I know Paolo Soleri very well, and I think very well of him as a human being, and I find him very inspiring to many other human beings in his humane viewpoint. I think of him more as a sculptor than an engineer, and I'm very sympathetic with his hope to serve humanity by what he gives you as an idea, but I do not think that is probably the way it is going to go. I think everything we will produce will be produced more mobilely and much more flexible kind of relationship for humanity. I say all humanity now is prone to become world human beings, and so we're going to have to accommodate the comings and goings and very new places.
The obsolescence of New York City brings us to another question that several members of the audience have raised, and that is whether there should be legislation or some public policy with a view to limiting the size of cities, limiting urban populations by some kind of device. I've asked the members of the audience to keep their questions short. Let me also ask that the panelists do likewise. We do have only about another half hour, 25 minutes left. Should we do something about limiting the size of cities?
I don't think that we can sit here in Washington, or someone can sit in Albany or Sacramento and say Los Angeles shall be X million people and enforce it in a free society. I do think, if I may return to a favorite subject of mine, and I have some scars in my back because of my association of it, I think communities ought to have the right to decide and the ability to decide the shape of their future. I'm talking about land use planning. You know, I could take any two people in this audience. I wouldn't need a Buckminster Fuller. I could go back 40 years, and we all point Los Angeles as the horrible example. I think any two of us could make just 3 or 4 decisions and put the same number of people. Nobody sat down in Los Angeles in 1915 or 20 and said, let's crowd 8 million people in this valley and let's crud it up with freeways and subdivisions going every direction. This was simply done by tens of thousands of individual decisions being made. And we could put the same number of people in that valley and save half the land and have twice the quality of life and use 1/3 less energy and everything else if we'd make some simple decisions through land use planning. And all land use planning is the ability for a community to sit down, hold some hearings, take industry and labor and environmentalists and everybody, minorities and all of them, and say, where's this community going? What size is it going to be in 30 years? And how can we shape that size so that the quality of life will be better? So I don't think that in any objective, final sense, someone ought to sit down and limit sizes of cities. But if we had land use planning, communities and cities and states could look ahead and make some decisions that would tend to put cities in the more optimum size than they are today instead of just sprawl.
Mr. Fuller, should we put a gate at the city and keep the people out after it reaches a certain size or not? Should we limit the size of our cities? Should we limit the population of our cities?
Should we limit the population of our cities? Should we limit the population of our cities?
We shouldn't limit anything. That's really what human beings are about, to delimit their capabilities and their faculties, how to relieve them, to give them a chance to really function as we're probably going to find out is supposed to function, so that I do not expect anything very positive from negative decisions.
Let's go back over here.
Anyway, okay. Morning. My name is Lee Rubin, and I'm a student at the American University here in Washington. My questions is directed to Secretary Hills. Carla, obviously, as Secretary of Urban Development, you have a plan or an established policy in the direction you wish the cities of our country to go. However, Frank Zarb and Al Ullman, who spoke here last month on energy, conceded that as of yet we don't really have an explicit energy policy. What then is HUD's policy as related to urban transportation and the energy problem? Are you waiting for a national policy? If so, why? If not, how close are you working with the Energy Commission?
HUD had proposed, and the administration had proposed, energy conservation measures in Title 10 of the Act. That's pending in Congress. We are working as an administration to address the energy problems straight across the board, and have given subsidy support to structures which are energy complete. With respect to transportation, the same concept is utilized. I'm sure, Mr. Rubin, you're aware of the efforts that have gone into some of our planned communities. This question really overlaps into the prior question of planned growth. And I think for the most part there is a variety of views that bear on what you may think is adequate planned growth and what other people in the audience may think. So the federal government has left that to the local communities which have in fact responded. And when you talk about legislation for land use planning or the like, we have many examples in this country today. No growth or planned growth policies, sewer moratoria, regional growth planning, and all kinds of restrictions which localities have imposed upon themselves in an effort to seek out a better living environment and a better quality of life. And in spite of the sharp remarks made about my hometown, I would say that Mr. Udall is correct, that had we been in 1915 as cognizant as we are today about the long-term effects of our decisions, our cities would take a better structural form and provide us all with a higher quality of life, but we're addressing it today.
Let's talk about some long-term things. Many of the proposals we've heard today and the kinds of humane programs we've heard discussed, whether we're talking about the rehabilitation of housing or better kinds of land use and planning, when we're talking primarily about housing people, and the better job we do for housing people who have money, the more pressure we put on those who don't have money, and the greater the necessity for subsidizing their housing needs. At bottom, we're talking about expenditures of new and, I suppose, very large amounts of money in terms of housing and other services that people need. And there's a real question of where this money is going to come from. And I'm wondering whether New York City, save for the question of scale, is the precursor of the fate of all our great cities. And if it is, what do we do about it?
Well, I don't want to lead off all the time, but let me give you 1 minute on New York City. I do think wherever the cities of this country are going, maybe New York is getting there first, and that this is a precursor. There has been there are two components in New York's problems. One is clearly mismanagement. They have tried for the last 10 years to finance a lot of operating costs out of issuing bonds, and the chickens have finally come home to roost, and this has got to be faced up, and New York City's got to be put on a sound basis. But in the broader picture, New York City's problems are national problems, and Philadelphia and Chicago and Boston and all of the other cities' problems are in large part national problems. If I had the power to do it, I would pass 3 pieces of legislation today in the Congress, national legislation, which would take the heat off New York and make it viable once again and would save all of the other cities. And those 3 pieces of legislation would be national health insurance. This is a national obligation. We should have had it 30 years ago. I would federalize the welfare system. It isn't Abe Beam's fault that we adopted a relationship with Puerto Rico that permitted up to 1 million poor, mostly poor Puerto Ricans to come to that city, or several million people from the South and Appalachia, black and white, who were poor, to come to that city. And the third bill I would pass would be the Hawkins-Humphrey Full Employment Act, which says that everybody in America who wants a job is going to have a job, and if we did those 3 things, New York City wouldn't be in trouble.
Beautiful.
Mrs. Percy Leon, originally from New York City and raised in the beauty of Connecticut, which I think can challenge Arizona a little. You speak primarily of providing in the rehabilitation of the inner cities housing for the lower income group. What about the middle income group? And what are you going to do about pollution, noise as well as air pollution, and the other services that are required in an inner city?
Mr. Udall, that sounds like yours again.
Well, I've learned to love New Jersey, New Hampshire, Massachusetts, Nebraska, Illinois, Wisconsin, and Connecticut. I've found great qualities up there. and many of them do challenge Arizona in beauty. You know, I think we've got to have a new turnaround here. Franklin Roosevelt in the 1930s set up the FHA, and it was one of the great chapters in our country. The idea was that every American was going to be able to own his own home if he wanted to. And we came pretty close to that ideal, better than any other country in the history of the world has ever done. As I pointed out a minute ago, we've now priced 4/5 of the American people out of the market for the new homes that the good people at the National Association of Home Builders build. I think for the 70s and 80s, we ought to have some programs, some new federal programs, which do for the inner cities, both for middle income and low income people, what we did mostly in the suburbs these last 30 or 40 years, make it possible for you to own your own home. And it ought to include the exciting homesteading concept that has some problems. It's been tried in places. It's going to involve some subsidies of the kind that Mrs. Hills and her department now administer. But surely there's enough imagination and innovation among us that we can try some new things in the cities so that people both low and middle income can own homes, and we can bring back some kind of community living in these big cities.
We are, in fact, however, trying a good number of new things, and we're finding that people in the middle income and even the upper income strata are being attracted back to the cities for a variety of reasons. Conveniences, the cost of sprawl, and the inconveniences attending that. And we are finding new kinds of structures being built in, around, and near inner cities. Townhouses have expanded their part of the home ownership market by 67% in the past 3 years, and condominiums were statistically insignificant 5 years ago, and we now have in our nation over 1 million units. So that and to mention homesteading, I'm glad you mentioned that, because we have a demonstration program which is going to be launched the 1st of October to prove the benefits in 12 cities to utilizing urban homesteading. And again, rather than have the federal government design the program and mandate it to the local communities, we are providing the housing and the rehabilitation funds, and the local communities are designing new, innovative, and exciting urban homesteading programs. So I think we are going to get an economic mix in our cities, and I think that is what's going to keep our cities alive. I don't see New York as the necessarily as the precursor of the downfall of all cities. It may be like the somewhat fortunate person who has a heart attack and survives, and then knows the level of living abilities after that period of time and lives to a ripe, happy, old, and productive age. And I think we have learned a lot from New York, but I do not see the demise of our cities in the next decade or two.
New York City may not be the precursor, and Washington, D.C. may not either. But one of the trends here, in terms of the rehabilitation of housing, whether it's government-assisted or otherwise, is that once the rehabilitation of the old housing stock gets well underway, it becomes middle-class and upper-middle-class housing, and in effect, we have the rich moving into the homes formerly occupied by the poor. I wonder whether the panelists, and I'm particularly concerned about Mr. Fuller's response, whether it should be a policy of cities or the national government to move the poor families to the rings around the cities, to almost reverse the trend we've got now, to have the poor live in the suburbs and the well-to-do in the cities, or would we try for some other kind of mix? How do you take the pressure of rehabilitating housing off the low income among us?
In view of what I've said earlier, that I now know that is technically feasible, the resources we now have, the knowledge we now have to actually take care of all humanity, the highest standard of living anybody's known, I see no excuse whatsoever for there being the poverty class. This is just completely irreasonable, but we are deeply preoccupied as we are here today, really talking about how we repair yesterday, and I did point out to you that our building industry is literally 5,000 years behind our capability in engineering, and as demonstrated in the airspace technology. This being so, when the government at the time of the New Deal took over the building industry by guaranteeing mortgages, it got into deeper and deeper mortgaging, and at that time the national debt was $36 billion. As you all know, the national debt today, though it has not yet been completely acknowledged by the Congress, is up in the magnitude of $800 billion. More than half of that, $400 billion, represents mortgages of the government underwriting completely obsolete industry. That's what I'm saying. There's a point now where you cannot pay the debt service on the national debt. The United States had gone literally bankrupt underwriting completely obsolete. That's how important the subject I'm really talking about how we really take the highest capability of man, instead of applying it to the weaponry, how do we kill, but how to really make those people successful. We're in for a very great reorientation. We're learning a lot of lessons. Fortunately, all of humanity is in on this. We are on the air. This is the way all humanity are on the air today. We are learning. But we're going to have to really learn that we must take our highest capabilities and apply them directly to making humanity a success. That's why I find this very educational, and the people who are here, great responsibility, earnestness everywhere, but we do get ourselves preoccupied, I say, continually how to reform that which doesn't really work.
Of course, one of the difficulties is that there is, at some point, enough housing, which means that people stop making money out of housing after a certain point. There's never enough weaponry, and if there ever is enough, we introduce new systems and make the old ones obsolete. So there's an endless means of making money, and I think that may be one of the key reasons why we're not doing some of the things you're talking about. Yeah.
Next year in Vancouver, there will be the United Nations conference called Habitat, which will be dealing with many of the problems we're discussing this morning. I would like to ask the panelists what they think the United States will contribute to this conference and what we will learn from it.
HUD is taking a role in Habitat along with the State Department, and we hope to have an informational exchange with a variety of the participants on their manner of structuring shelter for their peoples. And we have already commenced work on this and have had a number of very healthy exchanges with other countries, and I think it will be a successful conference.
Yes, I'm Caroline Punches, and I'm from California, and recently was in the process of conducting some public hearings dealing with housing patterns and their impacts on school segregation patterns. One of the main concerns that was expressed throughout our public hearings was that the monies provided by the federal government in housing and community development grants and also the Section 8 housing are inadequate to really do the job that needs to be done. And my basic question is, how or what is HUD doing to effectively lobby Congress so that they can get the monies to do a good job of providing housing for low and moderate income families? And to Congressman Udall, what is Congress planning on doing to get more monies into these programs where they will be effective programs?
It was never suggested when Congress with the administration passed the new Housing and Community Development Act that their rental subsidy program, which is the Section 8 program referred to, could benefit all peoples who had need first year go-around. Now, our budget is directed toward assisting 400,000 families this fiscal year. And similarly with our community development grants, we are spending more than we ever have spent before when we were dealing with the 8 categorical grant programs. In the old days, the communities would line up and fill out a grant for water and sewer or open spaces or a categorical grant. Whether they needed it or not, they would try to get into that line and engage in grantsmanship. Now we distribute the community development funds on a census basis, objectively determined on the basis of housing overcrowdedness, population, and poverty weighted twice. so that the communities have those funds and can address their housing needs and their community development needs. And I think the problem is, if we continue the program, we will be able to make a dent in the problem, but we cannot solve the entire problem first year around.
We've been talking about reordering priorities for a long time. It's become a cliche in this country. I would hope the Congress one of these days would really do something about it, but there's a new weapon that's being found useful and being brandished frequently in this town called a veto. And under this new game, if you have 1/3 of the House or Senate, you win. It doesn't matter what the majority wants, you win if you have 1/3. The defense budget this year, in the era of peace, the post-Vietnam era, and an era of negotiation rather than confrontation, and a generation of peace in President Nixon's phrase, the defense budget is up $16 billion. It's not down, it is up. If I had my way, and I think a majority of the Congress probably agrees with me now, if I had my way, I would have held military spending at about the same level and would have taken those $16 billion and put a lot of it on housing programs, some of the things we've been talking about here this morning.
I'm Margaret Malloy. As a retired Army wife, I've lived in a variety of cities: Damascus, Syria, Ankara, Turkey, New York City, Los Angeles, Tokyo. I'm very much for land use reform, as you can see. Today I want to say that I have recently visited a cooperative apartment in New York City in a slum, but it was attractive, clean, well organized, and occupied by some proud, self-reliant people who were formerly typical welfare cases. They own it, they built it, and they had some help from amateur people from the suburbs. They used scrounge materials and funds that were struggled for by a determined man who is known as the ghetto priest. This building was built from burned-out shell of a tenement that cost them $1,000. The man directing it, Father Fox, spends most of his time struggling for funds and fighting through bureaucratic New York City red tape. I want to know if you have ever heard of Father Fox or Full Circle Associates.
I hadn't heard of him, but I'd like to meet him. That's the kind of thing we're going to have to do. Exactly.
My answer is the same.
You haven't? Thank you very much.
There are similar cooperative community endeavors in quite a few cities that I know about, and they are experiencing, first place, often young people who have not had much experience, not used to responsibility, discovering they have a radio responsibility. They're finding themselves very badly opposed by communities. And everyone that I have visited and inspected, I think they're highly worthy of public support, and yet they're getting really just exactly the opposite. It is very good to have this come out in this meeting, that such endeavors are going on, and they are taking over whole apartment houses and managing them really very, very beautifully.
I'm mildly astonished that we've spent almost an hour talking about urban ills, and we have not mentioned at all the problem of race. I'm wondering if the panelists feel that the government's policy, that the government's position on the question of racial integration, for instance, should be simply to remove barriers to racial integration, or whether it should have a positive policy toward encouraging racial integration, both residential and otherwise.
Well, John Kennedy once said that we didn't all come over on the same ship, but we're all in the same boat, and this society isn't really going to work long haul unless we are an integrated society. And so I would take the latter view, that we not only, we don't just go to a policy of neutrality, but that we have an affirmative program of integration in this society and make it attractive and make it work. Part of the problem this week with all of these school busing difficulties around the country is that we have laid on the schools a tender kind of social institution that's carried so big of a load. We're trying to lay on the schools the whole burden of integrating society, and a lot of it ought to be laid on our housing policies instead.
Mr. Raspberry, HUD's programs do presently take an affirmative role rather than just removing the barriers. We would like to have absolute freedom of opportunity for every person to select their dwelling. But in addition, the statute expressly states that there will be an economic integration which necessarily overlaps with the racial question in this country. And secondly, the Civil Rights Act of 1968 imposes upon us as citizens an affirmative obligation which we think we're addressing in a forthright fashion.
I think this town meeting on the air, the audiences here, those of us here at the table, really all of one mind. As humanity is deeply concerned about humanity, but I just point out as an engineer and one who's operated in the real research and advanced activity for many, many years, that the total community does not invent the telephone nor the airplane. This is the work of the individual, and the little individual who finds technically better ways for society finds that what he has is usually not employed until society gets in a very great emergency. What we're really talking about today, about really the case of human beings themselves, not the weaponry and so forth, but we're really talking about human beings. That is our concern, and how we really serve them properly. This is coming out in the public domain in such an important way. There's much literacy. As a fine society will, in due course, find itself in very great emergency, because what I told you about the government having underwritten a completely obsolete way of carrying on. If the fits as those buildings were any good, they would pay for themselves in a year, would not need 20 and 30-year mortgages. The whole of New York City problem is long indebtedness, where you can't even meet the debt service, where we've continually been underwriting the old rather than tackling the new. So I would like to I really am hopeful that this meeting will be paying considerable attention to what are the kind of technical capabilities that we will find available as the emergencies increase. I'm personally quite confident from such meetings I've just been at out in Albuquerque. I was asked by the University, MIT, if I would come to there was an intercollegiate meeting of solution of energy harvesting problems. 30 of the largest universities in this country, engineering department, engineering students, were granted $5,000 each to back their producing technical equipment, new windmills, new methane gas energy converters, and so forth, sun energy impounders. And at Albuquerque, at Sandy Air Force Base this year, just a month ago, there was this exhibit of all this work. 30 scientists and engineers went over the work of each of the different student groups, 40 different exhibits. They had to have the apparatus must run for 24 hours, prove they really worked. And they were all rated for the BTUs or the KWH that they could turn out. And what was really important there was I could see the academic world, the engineering world, really turning to doing what just little individuals have been doing, the individual windmills and so forth. Suddenly it was getting to be everybody's business. And there was great evidence there that we can harvest our energy income, not using up the fossil fuel savings account, not burning up our ship atomically. There is now actually provable adequate energy income from other sources than burning up the fossil fuels or savings account. It's possible to take care of all of humanity at a higher standard of living as energy income by 1985, while completely phasing out all fossil fuels and all atomic energy. We now know that to be so. This is very big news. It's not the kind of news that our meeting opens with.
Thank you. I'm afraid we've run out of time.